Okay, cool. So thanks everyone for joining today's AI seminar at USC. So today I'm happy to introduce, we have 4 professors from USC Marshall School who are belonging the team of the USC Marshall Initiative on Digital Competition Speakers. So today they are going to talk about how do business law and regulation impact AI engineering researchers, so possible collaboration and also complementarities. Yeah, we have professors Mohammed and Anthony and Dina and also David from the Marshall School. So yeah, let's welcome their talk.
Great. Well, I'll start. I'm actually D. Daniel D. David is the first name that I don't use. Along with Anthony, I'm co-director of the Initiative on Digital Competition. We have funding, and the idea is we look to see how are digital platforms and how is basically digitization transforming business. And in many ways, you all are the important input. We can't have the transformation without you. How we ultimately commercialize, we work on together, and then law and regulation shape both the opportunities that exist and create potentially new opportunities. The reason why we have a group together across departments is because I want you to see the richness of what we think what we're doing may impact you all, and there are opportunities for collaboration on grants or in terms of commercialization. But I also want to signal something else. Anthony is a department chair. Dina is an associate dean. We think it's really important to bring some very senior people here because that is a signal of our commitment to you all. We also have in Mohammed, one of our newer faculty members, to show you it's not merely the most senior people, but rather this commitment to an initiative to really explore digital issues is really across the entire faculty. So with that, I'm going to pass it on to Anthony, he and I are going to give you some broad overview of in ways of just so that you understand how we frame issues and how it might be responsive to you. And Mohammed and Dina will go into much more detail about their specific types of work to give you a sense of some texture and flavor as to what that might look like. Anthony?
Yeah, thank you, Danny. So I'm just going to give a brief introduction. I think we're often siloed in our schools and departments, and sometimes we don't know. And I've run into this. What is business research? I just want to give you a sense of what research in business looks like, and then I'll talk a little bit about where AI enters into business school research. So a brief introduction, what do researchers in business schools study? Now we have disciplines like accounting, and accounting is not research on, how to write ledgers and things like that, but really fundamental questions about information disclosure and the impact of information disclosure, finance, economics, management and organizations, what sort of factors lead to effective organizations, organizational behavior, how are firm strategies determined, marketing, which is my field, really questions about how consumers, how firms serve consumers and meet their needs from beginning to end. We often equate, I think it's often equated that marketing is advertising, and we like to think it's much broader than that in meeting customer needs, whether that's whether it's product design and how the product's distributed, how firms meet consumers' needs. How do you understand the makeup of the market? And information systems, which is Mohammed's area, information systems is largely the study of how information systems work within firms and more broadly into the market. And I think historically Historically, it was something unique, but I think what we're seeing now is information systems going more broadly and touching all these other disciplines within the business school. Methodologically, business school researchers take their methods from computer science, particularly data sciences and statistics, and largely historically from the social sciences, and that's primarily focused on economic methodologies and psychological methodologies, lab experiments and such. And then what's the objective of business research? Generally, I'd break it down into two things. One, the understanding aspect, the questions of why do things happen? Why do businesses do what they do? Why do markets function the way they function? Much more attuned to business as a social science, trying to understand the process of business. And then the flip side of that is more from the operational perspectives. How can businesses and business systems be better run? And I think this touches more on the engineering approach and the operations research. So that's a very high level introduction to what researchers at business schools do. Turning more towards AI, the focus of this presentation, not surprisingly, the volumes of business data has really brought AI to business disciplines. And a lot of this data now is a lot of market data through transactions, social media, consumer tracking, and monitoring, say within the organization. And of course, a lot of the AI applications are concentrated on handling this type of data in a variety of ways. So therefore, it's concentrated mostly on machine learning. And I'm just going to walk through some of the high-level applications that we see with machine learning. A lot of prediction. So we want to understand, say, behaviors that will identify, say, behaviors, online behaviors, or otherwise, that predict whether a consumer will visit a store. Feature extraction. So we have a zillion variables. Which ones are important, and can we use those features to learn something? So a recent study by Netzer et al. At Columbia University looks at crowdfunding platforms and the text description for the crowdfunding. Is there language that's used on these on the description for the crowdfunding source? Are there ones that indicate default? And that could be very valuable to anybody who's thinking of giving. By the way, so these sites that I'm giving here are just to highlight typical papers for your own reference if you want to go back and look at some of these applications. And I've highlighted in red in a self-serving way. These are researchers at USC, at Marshall School, who are doing this type of work. Descriptive interpretations. So this is research that would look at, okay, can we take a lot of, say, unstructured data and make sense of what matters? So restaurants, for instance, look at postings on social media of particular dishes at restaurants. Are they going to be indicative of how consumers interpret them and how the restaurant fares? Estimation and optimization. So there's a lot of with the volumes of data and variables, can we exploit machine learning to improve econometric or statistical inference? And then prescriptive analysis using more reinforcement learning. So real-time, say, websites that are geared towards trying to understand how consumers react to different incentives, and then use that information real time to turn that around and give them targeted marketing actions, whether that be prices or promotions. And then finally, more recently, using machine learning to distill certain variables and to figure out which ones can we determine actually cause outcomes. And this is really ties back to my point earlier about the why. So causal interpretation really is trying to figure out the mechanisms for the underlying phenomena that we observe. I think one way that you might think about how the ISI can really add value to what we're thinking about. I put this on a paradigm here to think about these 6 applications on 2 dimensions that relate to, on the horizontal axis, method transparency. So how well do we need to understand the modeling and the method that's being used here? And then on the vertical dimension, how much it tells us something about the theory, how much is it informing us about the why things happen. And you see on the lower left is prediction. We may not really care about what's causing what or why things are happening. It's just how can we use all this data to really identify what we should do and what consumers or the market's going to do. We really don't care much more than that. It just helps us do business better. And then moving up towards feature extraction, we're a little bit more interested in the why, maybe not the mechanism, but what sort of factors matter for, say, default on crowdfunding platforms. And then moving up more towards the upper right is where we're really seeing questions about the why, causal interpretation, prescriptive analysis, what's actually going on, and can we use machine learning to distill all this data to actually learn something conceptual. And here's where I see the gold mine, if you will, or the area that really I think has the potential going forward, because it's been underexplored, and there's opportunities here more for understanding, connecting to causal interpretation, understanding the theory of what's going on and the mechanisms for what's going on. And then lastly, I just want to say that, business school research is really focused as well on the implications of AI. What are the implications of algorithmic bias, for instance? We have a junior faculty here in marketing who's trying to understand the role of algorithmic bias afforded by AI algorithms in loan financing and profiling. We also have a fresh faculty who's just joined us from Carnegie Mellon University, Mohammed Alyakoob, who's looking at the impact of, say, Zillow estimates, those estimates done by algorithmic tools. What are the further impacts on the price of houses that are sold and the subsequent prices in a neighborhood? And then some of my ongoing work with Nicole is looking at, well, can artificial intelligence algorithms be strategically manipulated? And this is a rising concern among the iBuyers that you see on Zillow and others who buy houses through algorithmic programming, which we've seen in finance over the years. What sort of implications this is going to have? So that's a quick high-level introduction into AI in business research. I'll hand it over to Danny to talk a little bit more about law.
Thank you, Anthony. So normally your interaction with lawyers on campus is someone in the general counsel's office whose job is basically to tell you what you can't do. I'm going to tell you, in fact, law is much broader than just don't do this, but rather law shapes opportunities. And you should think of law as risk, as a risk assessment exercise. So if we think about the business side as how do we commercialize, law basically shapes everything from the moment that you have the idea. The idea is yours. That's the beauty of being a PhD in some engineering field. Every other step of the way beyond the does the technology work, law shapes that opportunity. Is the idea yours? If the idea is yours, how do you basically grow that idea? How do you protect that idea? What kind of rights does the idea have, etc.? So we can think about, I'm going to start with defining things because, again, the only law that you saw was Bill Shatner from Boston Legal, so I have to probably explain things a little bit better. So it's a unique set of legal rules or legal practices. Sometimes the government is creating these rules, but guess what? Sometimes private parties are creating these rules. You see this all the time. It's called USC is basically setting the terms for some kind of licensing of your IP that you created on campus. So we can think of rules, right? so that would be, we have the Constitution that sets up a rule system. We have statutes that's like things on the books and all kinds of regulations, but we also have what we call common law. So the law of contract is largely common law. It's between two parties. The rules is being set by private parties. And so this is another thing I want to impart to you. Law either comes from the government or private parties, sometimes a little bit of both. And the legal practices is maybe an extension of that, thinking about this kind of private ordering. Essentially, government doesn't intervene unless there's some kind of other malfunction. So when you hear about these antitrust cases against tech companies, it's where somehow the market hasn't worked. The contractual terms seem to be in some ways illegal because of the amount of coercion that one party has over another. Then we have formal law that steps in. But we can also think not of just law and legal practices, but something called legal bodies. Basically, the legal ecosystem, largely. So we can, regulation, we think a lot of ex ante type things of basically either things you can't do or things that the government is going to shape what you can and cannot do. So Anthony talked about, for example, real estate. So there's all kinds of limitations, regulatory limitations on whether or not, for example, you can sell or rent in certain areas for real estate. That's regulation. By the way, regulation is also, how we think of privacy, which is shaping what you can and cannot do. And if you think there's one thing called privacy, let me tell you, law is complex, and we have different privacy rules for different kinds of data. And then, oh, by the way, there's this other area that shapes law and business, and it's called ethics. And we think of ethical AI, and this is just an extension of that. We think of legal ethics, we think of business ethics. It also comes into play with many of the issues that Anthony talked about. So it turns out in business and law, we study ethical issues because it's fundamental to some of what we do. And more importantly, even if you don't believe in it, NSF believes in it. They have that ethical component. So you should at least nod along and pretend like you believe in it and say, no, we have that covered in our proposal. Okay, so I'm going to focus on AI and law and regulation. So you know what algorithms are. And if you didn't know before, Anthony explained its application. So we can think of so many different areas in which you are playing an important role. I give you just a number of different areas that are changing, so many areas, but this is just a little sampling just to give you a flavor. This is like when you get the appetizer platters at a restaurant when you're going out with your friends, say Friday afternoon. Remember when we used to do that here on campus? Not so much anymore. But actually I want to focus really on data ownership and control again, because these are two distinct issues. You have different kinds of legal rights. One is you own something, but beyond ownership, sometimes you may have control without ownership. So you've thought about this possibly in the context of IP before, for example, licensing. You license the use, that's about control, but you don't actually give up the ownership. The patent, for example, is yours. So what I'm about to tell you is that the risk analysis for law is significant because law is all over the place. Who owns the data, right? We do not have clear answers in law. For those of you in the broader area of engineering who think, oh wait, law has answers, the answer is no. Very rarely does not law have answers. Occasionally it does, like you shouldn't murder somebody, right? That's easy. Most other areas of law, not so easy. And it turns out it's complicated because different countries have different laws on the same topic. And you have to somehow deal with overlapping laws and regulations. So I give you some examples as to who owns data. It's different in 3 important jurisdictions. I chose one in the United States, one in Europe, and one in Asia. So unclear, but by the way, we have the same kind of problem in the United States. We don't have something called privacy law that's at the national level. We don't have a privacy law like that. We have bits and pieces and literally multiple privacy laws, but not national privacy law. And oh, by the way, state law matters, particularly California law, which is quite aggressive in this area. So I want you to think about different kinds of data, because each of this different kind of data may have a different answer as to who owns it. And the reason why I put this up for you is because I want you to understand in your own decision-making process, you need to be thinking about this in your proposals very early stage, because if you're not thinking about it, not only do you get bounced by whether it's DARPA or NSF or whoever is funding you, if you're thinking about commercializing it and you don't have a better sense of the risk of who may or may not own the data, no private investor is going to give you money for it either, because they think that your idea is pie in the sky without any real application to the world we live in. So how do we protect rights for data? Largely contract and IP. So we have trade secret. By the way, it's only if a secret if you keep it secret. I've now, we have a course on this in the law school. It's 3 credits. I've just given you the answer in 1 sentence. It's only a secret if it's secret. And I give you some excerpts from particular cases, which I thought might be helpful. And the first one is actually to the US code, so you get a sense of how trade secret law works. We could think also as copyright. So it's not just software that is copyright. Data may in fact have copyright. That is the database in the United States has copyright. Data itself is not copyrightable, again, in the United States. It is, for example, in Brazil. So again, you have to be thinking about these issues, because when you're looking to sell your innovation, part of the valuation, remember Anthony showed you the accounting and the finance people in one of his early slides, it's all about valuation. If it's not clear who owns the data and who has use of the data, guess what? Your valuation is that much lower, because you've just presented business risk. Your legal risk is now business risk, and that means less money for you. So it turns out we protect not just with IP, but also traditional contract law. What does data mean? What the contract says it means. And we have property rights with regards to data, and these rights are also defensible. So I want to give you, from the privacy standpoint, where's the sort of high risk, medium risk, and low risk? Because again, law is not operating in a vacuum. Law is shaping your business opportunities, and frankly, your business opportunities are shaping your opportunities in terms of the kind of research you take and how you really frame your research. So I want you to think then, as you all are engineers, this kind of decision tree makes sense to you, hopefully. What is it that law is really responding to? Threats and vulnerabilities, then figuring out, let's say for data breach, risk and governance mechanisms to prevent or mitigate risk, and the kind of impacts and responses that you'll take with these kinds of issues. So anytime that you're thinking about commercializing your innovation, this is going to really, really matter, because one of the big questions is, how are you protecting that data? Now we, after having shown you different data has different types of risk, for breach, is there a mechanism in place? And the answer is yes. So this is also the kind of research that we do, and this is the kind of thinking that we do that we think is beneficial on the business side and beneficial with regards to the innovation side. What am I doing in terms of my research? A lot of work involving textual analysis machine learning. One area involves collusion. So think about how you might have signaling that companies do, that they basically signal to each other through, let's say, securities filings, that they may signal through bankruptcy filings to basically either tacitly collude, which is perfectly legal. The gas station on one side of the street says it's going to be $4.70. Gas station on the other side of the street independently looks at that and says, that's, I guess, what we're charging. You know what makes that criminal, for which people go to jail? When the gas station on one side of the street says, how about, calls you up and says, how about we both charge $4.70? That's the difference between going to jail versus making a lot of money through totally legal tacit collusion. And one of the things I'm trying to look at is, how do companies strategically behave to not go to jail? They can signal to other companies totally legally through all kinds of public documents. Another thing I'm looking at is data breaches. Specifically, how is it that companies identify their own risk in their securities filings, and when do we see changes? And are we seeing some kind of causal inference? Can we make a causal inference with regard to one of those changes? So for example, the first of the major data breaches that we can think of, was Target's breach in 2013. If you recall, literally 20% of all Target Red Card customers actually ripped up their red cards because they didn't trust Target anymore. So AI is all about trust. We can think about contractual provisions. So I have an NSF grant, which I'm looking to see if I can get funded, looking at who has rights to data with regards to agriculture, and particularly, as it say, John Deere providing tractors, like what rights do farmers have, in the various contracts that they have with their providers. Another thing that I'm in the very early stage on is looking at cognitive decline, specifically looking at the use of certain words and also the speed of words, particularly of CEOs. Do we see that older CEOs have some kind of cognitive decline, and is that frankly important in a corporate governance business setting? So this actually builds off existing literature that we see people have studied for concussions for athletes or Alzheimer's, to measure cognitive decline. One could do it with government officials as well. That's not my interest, but I'm sure there's somebody in the broader area of law doing that. And then I have just a broader thought piece right now focusing on how do we think about AI and trust, and what are the mechanisms in law to help create trust for AI? So part of this goes to some of the questions that we were talking about. I'm going to pass it over then to Mohammed. Mohammed, it's now your show.
Well, thank you very much, Daniel. While I'm sharing my screen, I will preemptively apologize for my voice. I am feeling a little bit under the weather, so I apologize to everybody. Let me see here. 10
days away from campus is what I just heard.
That's what I've heard as well. Okay. Yeah, okay. So what I would like to do for my time is to start by briefly summarizing some of my research interests. And then, as was indicated before, I'll try to go into a little more detail about two specific projects, which I hope can motivate interest in the potential for collaboration. So my interests generally lie in understanding the impact of digital transformations. And as we know, digital transformations have impacted a huge number of industries. Just to name, just to look at a few at the top here, retail and lodging and others that I'm interested in or that I hope to do research on in the future as well. But the way I try to look at it is, when we think about digital transformations, they've of course impacted a huge number of industries, but as well as a huge number of individuals. And by impacting individuals, of course, there's this sort of notion that digital transformations can bring about this positive impact in a way where they can benefit society. And specifically, we often hear these words about removing boundaries or democratizing access, et cetera. Now, the important thing to understand, and at least the thing that I am interested in, is that a lot of times this potential can be mitigated by more traditional factors, such as market structure or economic activity or demographic profiles of the participants. So with that sort of very brief overview of the general research that I am interested in, we'll jump into the two specific research projects, which I'll very briefly summarize here, and hopefully can motivate some interest in any sort of collaborations down the line. So the first, and I guess just for the sake of time, we'll just jump into the first project. So in this research project, my co-authors and I investigate the competitive dynamics between traditional providers of financial services and fintech products. As Anthony hinted earlier in the talk, fintech products are disrupting financial systems and having an impact to the extent that they are altering traditional financial products. So of course, you know, the fintech ecosystem is quite large, and the part of that ecosystem that we're interested in this project is the lending and the financing side of it, with a specific focus on peer-to-peer lending, which is basically where individuals can lend and borrow from each other, bypassing traditional operators. Now, to give you a backdrop of the industry which this all takes place under, traditionally, when we think about banking competition, we think about banking competition in terms of geographic clusters. This is specifically when we think about assessing it for the potential for mergers and such. And there was interest to understand, and continued interest to understand whether these clusters are going to continue when you have things like deregulation or even new technological changes such as ATM and mobile banking. And when we think about these now fintech and peer-to-peer providers, what we see is that they have these claims about democratizing the lending market and potentially removing or bypassing some of these traditional geographic restrictions, since they don't really operate in geographic clusters, of course, right? And so what we investigate is the potential for local banking competition that continues to operate within geographic clusters mentioned previously, and how it has an impact on the debt management behavior of these fintech borrowers, right? These borrowers that are supposedly operating on these digital platforms that may circumvent these geographic restrictions. The basic idea is that if a certain type of borrower may have been underserved by their local competitive markets, maybe they can utilize fintech offerings to improve their financial status and eventually become viable to the local markets. Then these borrowers in more competitive markets will return back to the advantage provided by the offline competitive markets. Now, from a regulatory perspective, this is very important as we consider how this relationship exists within a landscape that assesses the viability of mergers based on local market conditions. So very quickly to summarize the findings in this project, we do find that offline banking competition remains to have a salient impact on these fintech borrowers. And perhaps more importantly is that bank mergers and bank closures have a very significant impact on these fintech borrowers. Now, in terms of AI, there are a couple of points that I want to quickly touch upon in this project. The first is that in our study, we had to define market competition, and to complement traditional measures, we use clustering approaches to try and define geographic markets. Second, as banks and more specifically fintech providers utilize algorithms to decide which borrowers are worthy of obtaining a loan based on some predicted measure of default, there is growing literature in this space that attempts to understand the potential for these algorithms to be unfairly biased against specific groups. I think Anthony also hinted at this in his talk with some of the work goes on at USC in the marketing group. In the second project that I want to highlight, I want to just first highlight the capacity for these digital platforms, such as Amazon and Etsy and all these other ones, to enable micro entrepreneurs, small and large businesses to transact with consumers with really unprecedented efficiency. I mean, there's this sort of anecdotal story about this young girl who was featured in President Biden's inauguration about she had a digital lemonade stand where she was able to obtain donations. Now, the rapid growth and wider market reach of these digital marketplaces has the potential to promote equal access that can hopefully overcome some of the documented failures in terms of providing equal access to minority entrepreneurs. And this is very much in line with the recent general calls for equity and promotion of equality of outcome, and digital platforms have engaged in this call. Companies like Amazon and eBay have undertaken initiatives to try and support the entrepreneurs on these platforms, the minority entrepreneurs on these platforms, in achieving and promoting equality in their outcomes on these platforms. Now, the sort of issues about equality of outcome on these platforms that are facing these entrepreneurs are perhaps more highlighted in what we like to call the sharing economy platforms, for the simple reason of that on these platforms, Oftentimes, platform owners deem the revealing of participants' identity as necessary because of the personal nature of the product offered, right? You're sharing your car or you're sharing a home with somebody, et cetera. But in the same token, I think these same platforms also have a huge amount of effect and potential to affect the information flow that occurs on these platforms, right? And they have various methodologies of enabling this digital trust. Of course, there's reviews, which I'm hoping to see Dina talk a lot about that in the next part of the presentation. And then there's other measures as well, such as there's money back guarantees and stuff. And in this talk, we're going to try to look at a different one, which is when the platform comes in and the platform sponsors a participant. So they're able to sort of, through the information flow, provide a very credible signal, the platform-based credible signal of the quality of some of their members. And we specifically ask whether platform certification, this sort of platform-initiated signal, this market design choice that the platform can undertake, can reduce discrimination against Black sellers. Specifically, we're going to look at Airbnb and Black hosts and promote between group equity in digital marketplaces. To sort of very quickly give you a brief idea of the general, the framing that we would take if you have these sort of two, assuming quite similar hosts, but there are these differences in outcomes in terms of the Black host maybe on Airbnb has 5 reservations over the same time span, whereas the white host has 10. The idea is that the platform comes in and provides this credible signal of quality, and there are the outcome is quite similar, but that the gain by the minority host is larger. This can perhaps overcome some of the initial difference that might have been caused by discrimination. What I want to highlight quickly before I turn it over to Dina in this study, before I get to the results very, very quickly, is just that one of the things that we had in this project was we had an enormous amount of data. We had the photos, we had reviews, we had everything. And so what it allowed us to do is try to utilize some methods to proxy for some of the unobservable factors that impact the demand. We looked at, for example, n-gram of listing description. We tried to do topic modeling of the review text. We even looked at the listing images and tried to predict the aesthetic score of those images, et cetera, as well as the hosts themselves in terms of the picture. So for the sake of time, because I don't want to jump into Dina's time, I'm going to actually jump right into the summary of findings for this, and then I want to just briefly discuss the some of the AI stuff as well. So what we found was that platform certification can work as an effective tool to mitigate statistical discrimination fostered by identifiable information on digital marketplaces. Identifiable information and trust mechanisms leads to significant discrimination against minority hosts, and platform sponsorship can have an impact role in promoting equitable outcomes. One of the things that I want to highlight before I quickly turn it over to Dina is that a lot of times these platforms are depending on algorithms to predict and decide which of the hosts are given priority, which are shown first. And I think if they are, one of the things that I think we need to think about is how do we include the potential for these sort of algorithms themselves that highlight certain individuals to be tools to promote equitable outcomes on these platforms as well. So with that, I will turn it over to Dina, and I'm sorry for only giving you 12 more minutes, Dina.
It's all good. It's all good. That was great. Thank you, everyone. So let me share my screen. Can you guys see? Give me a thumbs up if you can see the slides. All right. So thank you for having all of us.
Actually, Dina, yes, the slides just popped up.
Oh, okay. So I am a professor of marketing. Anthony is my colleague. So I'm also an associate dean for the PhD program. And I'm not really an AI researcher, which I know is a little, embarrassing in this crowd, but I am AI adjacent. So I can say I'm AI curious. So I come from this former Soviet Union. My PhD is from, actually my 2 degrees, undergrad and PhD from IT. I was at Yale before, and now I'm here. So this is a picture of, and I've been here for almost a decade. This is a picture of our one of our PhD cohorts. It's a picture of me in our Soviet school. All right, so I study social interactions and the firm's management of social interactions. Here are some graphs, all social interactions, word of mouth talk started with graphs that show how popular social media is. So I started doing this work on Usenet, back in the day. And now, of course, we have all kinds of platforms. So I study word of mouth. So I think kind of a fair question to ask is what exactly drives consumer word of mouth? And so, I structure my talk talking about sort of two lenses on this issue is the issue of motivation and also the issue of network structure. And the issue of network structure is probably closer to computer scientists. And there's been a lot of work on the network structure part of it in computer science. So, let's think about some of the questions that you can ask in terms of motivation. So again, this is what drives, reviews or other online interactions between consumers. And so, for example, we're a center that studies platform competition. So let's imagine a platform wants to, or a seller wants to change, impact the distribution of reviews. How can you do that, without, legally or not legally, with or without cheating? Also, you can have sort of different features of the platform. So you can allow the manager to respond. We have a paper on that. And then from the perspective of social networks, how can we measure meaningful, how can we get meaningful metrics of word of mouth? And what types of conversations should the firm encourage, keeping in mind that, again, networks matter. So there are, of course, many more topics that you can discuss or questions that you can ask. These are some of the ones that I have worked on. And so I'll quickly sort of give you a flavor of the type of research I do. And in case, again, this is meant to be, something that encourages collaboration. If you guys see some, some overlap, again, I would be happy to talk. So here's a paper that actually just thankfully got a conditional accept in one of our journals. And it asks, the paper looks at something that we observe in practice, which is a certain type of distribution of reviews online. And these are pictures from other papers, and they show what's called the J-shaped distribution, which means that we see a lot of 5-star reviews. So on the x-axis, you have what's called the valence of reviews at 1, 2, 3, or 5, 4 or 5. So you see a big bump. A lot of reviews online are very, very positive. And then you also see a bump, kind of a smaller bump around very negative reviews. So it looks like a J. And so this paper, looks at this empirical finding, very robust empirical finding, and tries to figure out the mechanism behind that. So what drives that? And so different mechanisms have been proposed. One is what's called the utility hypothesis, which is this idea that just people get a kick out of either being super positive about positive things or a bit of revenge if something bad happens. There's the base rate hypothesis, which is that, most things are very positive, most experiences are very positive because you do some search ahead of time. Once in a while, you make a mistake. And then what we propose is a forgetting hypothesis, which is that when you have more extreme experiences, you're more likely to remember and to talk about them, by writing a review. And if you have sort of more moderate experiences, you're more likely to forget. And so what we study is what happens if you send out a reminder to consumers to post a review. And so different explanations have a different, predict different effects. So our explanation predicts that reviews become less extreme, and the utility hypothesis predicts the opposite. And so we worked, and again, this is something that's fairly common, are these kind of field experiments where you work with a company. We worked with a very large platform that's based in Germany. It's like a hotel, like an Expedia platform. And they implemented this field test with us. So they, so basically they varied the time of the reminder. So we had this nice kind of test and control feature. And so the main result is that we find that reminder causes a decrease in extremity of the distribution. And then of course, the heart of the paper sort of giving an explanation for that. Okay, so kind of showing the mechanism for that. And this has, all kinds of interesting implications for platform design. which is, for example, if you send reminders, you're going to have more, you're going to sample from reviews in the middle. Also this idea that reviews are biased as in terms of how they represent the underlying experiences. And so you might want to debias them. And also we find that, if you send a reminder right away, you get more reviews. A lot of platforms worry about having more reviews. Here's another explanation that I think is very interesting for computer scientists. And its motivation was a different type of motivation. So as Danny would say, it's outside of the legal sphere. And that's another issue that I have studied, which is fake reviews. Okay, so this idea that you might have call it promotional chat or fake word of mouth. And so, so this is actually an issue that AI has often been proposed as a solution, which is basically, how can you tell when a review is fake? Well, maybe we can look at some kind of linguistic regularities, maybe, and so there have been studies that show that, well, maybe reviews that are fake are, less likely to talk about features or have more emojis or whatever it is. So this is not the approach that we take. We take a very different approach, which is, we look at two different platforms. One is TripAdvisor, where it's sort of easy to fake a review, and the other one is Expedia, where you have to log in. They verify your purchase, and then we look at different incentives of hotels. So depending on their geography, are they next to a competitor? Depending on how big is the hotel, how many properties do they own? They have different incentives to fake. And again, we look at the difference in the distributions. So our research, we can't really tell if any one particular review is fake or not. But what we can do is to say, look, for this hotel, we predict that there will be more, this hotel is going to have more positive reviews because, it's a small property and so forth. Or maybe this hotel we predict will have more negative reviews because it's located next to its competitors. And that's what we observe. So we observe that ownership matters, competitive structure matters, but again, we can't tell if any one review in particular is fake or not. And then here's another kind of platform question, which is, should you respond to reviews that are posted? And we use the same kind of trick, which is we look at differences across platforms. Some platforms allow and some platforms don't allow response. And we look at the same hotel across different platforms. And so, so we find this interesting result, which is that responding to reviews by the manager, let's say, actually encourages more negative reviews to be posted. And the intuition, we think, is that people are trying to be helpful. So when they see that the manager is listening, they kind of give some issues that you can fix. And so we have, this is just data we collected from a little experiment. And we show that our raters think that the one-star reviews tend to be more useful to the manager because they're pointing out some issues. Okay, so let me just spend the last 2 minutes that I have. So I have, just to kind of give you a quick, here's just a mention, shout out to this study. I think it's my first published paper. And in that paper, we looked at the, we calculate the entropy of the spread of word of mouth. And we show that, across communities, this is the Usenet one, and we show that the more dispersed word of mouth was associated with higher ratings, okay, for TV shows. Okay, so one last thing, which is, what about the role of AI? Okay, so again, I haven't actually, we do have folks in marketing who actually study, AI issues and word of mouth. I'm not one of them. So, the basic questions about what information can be gathered from text. And there has been some research on that, information on product features and so forth. I do think that beyond that, it's sort of, there may be some open questions on what else we can gather, aside from, exactly how people felt about features. And so I think there is some space for that. you know, this issue I mentioned, this issue of fake or not, fake reviews or not, you know, it's again, I don't think has really been solved. So it's an open question. And then I just wanted to give a shout out to my colleague, to Ryan and Anthony's colleague, Kristen Deal, who's actually a consumer behavior researcher. And she has written a lot of papers on photos. Okay, so kind of how, you know, taking photos, how that changes your motivations to post on social media. And so, you know, and just how, you know, it changes your enjoyment from the experience, this idea of taking photos. And then of course there's, you know, beyond text, there's video and audio. I think there's somebody on the market who is looking at, you know, music and how to use AI for looking at music. So I still think there are lots of questions and, you know, lots of areas for collaboration. And I think I'm going to end here and turn it over to questions. So Peter, did you want to?
Yeah, okay, so yeah, thanks Dina and Anthony, Mohammed, and also Daniel for the very rich talk. And we're very happy to hear lots of the interesting research that are ongoing in the Marshall School, and also hope to see lots of collaborations between Marshall School and USCISI. So yeah, let's see if the audience have any questions.
So Muhar, I'd like to ask a question, if I may.
Yes,
this is really interesting. I mean, lots of really interesting problems that you guys talked about. I see lots of potential opportunities for collaboration. But as you probably know, one of the challenges, of course, for people at ISI is the fact that, you know, we're on soft money, right? So it means that for any project that we do, we actually have to find a source of funding to actually support that project. And, you know, we've gotten funding in the past from NSF, like the SPE program. But I'm curious if you guys have ideas or thoughts about where we could actually go after funding to support some of these kinds of projects.
So I'll start by saying I think NSF is the gift that keeps on giving, and increasingly they seem to want more interdisciplinarity in their research. Whether or not what they say is what they mean, you have a better sense of than I do. But what we keep hearing from NSF is they want to see more, quote unquote, societal impact in terms of what they fund. And part of that societal impact goes to some of these kinds of questions. So understanding fake reviews matters a lot, not merely from the commercial standpoint, but also to things like political speech and electioneering and things like that, for which there's also money. So there's money also from the Department of Transportation that goes to some of these kinds of questions, as it may go to, let's say, Uber and Lyft and optimization of traffic. There is some money that comes from Department of Energy that might focus on some related issues to what we're talking about. It's many of the usual funding sources among government agencies, but I think with the following twist: as it's gotten harder and harder to get funding, you need that special little something. So if we could talk about my favorite show, The Great British Baking Show, right? You get a certain amount for like the flavors, right? You know, like it's not just a presentation anymore. Now you have to also like transform something. And so we're helping with that transformation process. We're not going to get you funding you wouldn't have otherwise gotten from different sources, but we're just increasing the likelihood of you putting in money, Craig, and time and resources to get more money and resources out of it.
Great, thank you.
I have no idea. We don't really have a funding structure, but yeah, I mean, I think that sometimes companies also have money, but I usually just write. I mean, also a lot of the stuff I do doesn't really require that much money. You know, you're like scrape something, or you know, you would work with a company. There's no real, you know, setup.
I was going to actually follow up on that. So, for some of these projects, it sounds like, there's a case, what Mohammed was talking about was a very deep integration with, like Airbnb, for example. Diana, when you were talking about your project, it sounded more like scraping. So, how do you actually maintain these relationships with potentially private companies? The data sounds very rich, but, obviously there's kind of, certainly sometimes restrictions that these companies will put on how you can use their data, and certainly publishing about that data can be tricky. So do you have any thoughts on, how to build those relationships, or something that maybe from a business school perspective is different than we from a, AI perspective view these sorts of relationships or getting data?
I can answer it quickly. Maybe Mohammed can also. So I think, early on I scraped data. I didn't ask for permission. Obviously we can't do that anymore. My last two projects I worked with a company, usually sign an NDA. There's usually some kind of an inside, we had one of my co-authors, had kind of a personal contact, at the company, a friend who worked at the company. That's one of the challenges is to find those opportunities, and we're trying to publish stuff. The companies are trying to, so it takes a certain kind of openness for a company to be able to, to agree to this kind of agreement. There's, again, there's sort of legal requirements that kick in, but I worked maybe with, 3 or 4 companies so far, and, those companies exist, that they really want to find an answer to the question. They get something out of it, and then they get kind of early access to findings. And it's usually, it only happens, I talk to a lot more companies than the papers I publish. It doesn't, and sometimes I'll have 5 meetings with a company, and in the 6th one it all falls apart. That definitely has happened to me. But again, I've been able to once in a while you find that great collaboration, and it works out great. Mohammed, do you want to?
Yeah, I'll just add quickly to that. So I'm probably more similar to Dina than maybe it appears. I'm actually more of somebody who scrapes and tries to get it from secondary sources than the primary source. But in terms of, I have started on collaborations with company. I think I agree completely with Dina that you have to, at least the way we've worked is you have to really show them your value to them first, and that takes a lot of effort and a lot of time, and a lot of times it can lead nowhere after you give them that effort. But in some cases it has been quite fruitful once that relationship has been established, and then you're sort of trying to answer some tangential question to what it is that they're actually getting at. So
could I jump in? I've been in a similar situation. So I've done scraping as well, Airbnb data. But I want to talk about 2 different profiles of companies. So I think the situation that Dina talks about is correct, but I want to sort of put it from an institutional perspective. There's somebody in a company generally who thinks that there's a positive story to say. If it's just we don't know what we want, that typically doesn't go anywhere in the company, because they don't want to find out that in fact research is going to show the opposite of either what the business strategy is, or that it is identifying risks that the company would rather not become public. So implicit is this sense that they have a positive story to tell, but they don't have the resources to do it on their own, number one, and what they're looking for is essentially free consulting. Number 2, what they're also looking to do is to justify increased headcount for their data science group. So let's say they've got 10 people. If they're able to work with researchers and say, wow, look at what we're able to do, and this is value that even the bean counters, the accountants can understand. The people that Anthony talked about, not the research accounting, but the people who are literally sitting and looking at the ledger, when they say, data is not a profit center, and you say, no, it is. Maybe not in a traditional accounting sense, but this is the value that we can unlock for the company. Now, all of a sudden, you empower people within the organization. And once you can do that, they can go to their superiors and say, here is a value proposition that is financial ultimately. It's not about altruism and working with people. It's not about getting PhDs and master's students from Viterbi. It's actually going to create the company value. If if you're able to do that, your hit rate for getting company proprietary data, I think, is going to be much, much better. And what Dina talked about, the frustration of 5 or 6 meetings, is in part working through that process and getting internal buy-in from different stakeholders within the company. So that sort of puts it, I think, in a perspective of why it sometimes breaks down. Sometimes because it turns out it's a different strategic focus. Sometimes actually it turns out they don't like what might be offered, and sometimes it's simply they don't have enough time and resources, because it turns out for everything that we want, they need to justify spending their time away from making money to helping us. And the only other thing that I would add is some of the larger companies, in fact, have a very good sense and have the financial resources to at least seed some of this kind of research, where I know that they already work with Viterbi with smaller grants, and sometimes, you know, grants that are large enough. And the value add there, again, this is being recorded, so let's not disseminate widely. My understanding is federal funding means that main campus takes more than 50% of a cut. If it comes from a company, it's a much smaller percentage, which means more money to basically fund your PhD students.
Yeah, thank you. That was very illuminating from all of you.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, thanks for the questions and also all the answers by the speakers. And we are about to reach the end of the seminar, and we'll post the recording to Slack and also sharing with the speakers after we have edited it. And also thanks once again for to the speakers for giving this very rich talk. Yeah, hope we can get into more collaborations between these two institutes and the schools. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.